Good morning, student. Today we are start our ninth and last topic, disaster management. Natural disasters have caused widespread loss of life and property. Human beings are now becoming more aware, and various steps have been taken at different levels to reduce their effects of disaster. Identification and classification of disaster is considered the first step to deal with disaster. Let us see the type of disaster. Disaster can be classified into various types depending on their origin. They can be of the following types: tectonic disaster, earthquake, volcanic eruption, tsunamis, etc. Example: the Great Tsunami and earthquake of Indonesia occurred on 26 December 2004. Geological: landslide, mudslides, avalanches. Example: the marine mudslides of 2014 in Maharashtra. Meteorological: food, cyclone, storms, heat waves, etc. Example: the floods of Kerala 2018. Biological: locust attacks, pest attacks, epidemics such as flu, dengue, cholera, corona, etc. Example: the Surat plagues of 1992. Anthropogenic or man-made: industrial accidents, transportation accidents, nuclear accidents, etc. Example: Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984. Thus, we see the disaster can be natural or man-made. Some disaster can be prevented. Generally, man-made disaster can be prevented as they happen due to mistakes or carelessness by human. This disaster affects human population while some ever may occur only in nature. For example, volcanic eruption is a natural process which cannot be prevented. Such natural events are called hazards when they occur in areas inhabited by human and caused damage. They are termed disaster. Next is see the hazards. Hazards are phenomena that pose the threat to people, structure, or economic ascent and which may cause a disaster. They could be either natural occurring in the environment or man-made. Thus, high rainfall is a hazard as it may cause floods which may be disaster. A hazards become a disaster when it affects human population settlement and their activities. Next is a vulnerability. In this example, give in the table, we find the population living in certain area are exposed to particular disaster. In the above example, in case of cyclone, people in the coastal area of India are more likely to be affected than these in the interior. People living in seismologically active area in prone to earthquake. At times, the social, economic, and political conditions may make people are more likely to be affected by disaster in some region. For example, the poor and more likely to be affected by disasters. Similarly, old people and children can be easily become victims of disaster. Densely populated area are more likely to affected than sparsely populated area. The geographical conditions are circumstance of people or regions that make the sustainable to a disaster is known as vulnerability. These, if they are vulnerable, you have to be better prepared, and if we are better prepared, we can reduce the risk of getting affected by the disaster. Capacity of cope: the ability of the people, organization, and the system using available skill and resources to face and manage disaster is known as their capacity of cope. This vulnerability is reduces if the capacity to cope with the disaster is high. For example, in 1999, the cyclone had caused 10,000 deaths, but in 219, only 89 deaths occurred due to cyclones. These show that capacity to cope has improved. Next is the effects of disaster. The disaster can bring the admitted and long-term effects of various sectors of a society. Primary effects occur as a result of the disaster itself. For example, damage during a flood or collapse of buildings during earthquake. Secondary effects over become primary effects has caused them. For example, fire, ignited dispersions of electrical power and water services as a result of earthquake. Tertiary effects are long-term effects that are a result of a primary and secondary effects. This includes things like loss of humans, permanent change in the position of river channel, and the adverse effects on tourism in an affected area due to earthquake, etc. Next is a disaster management. In all the example of disaster give in a table, disaster like a gas leakage and oil, and rail accident could have been prevented. Disaster like volcanic eruption, tsunami, earthquake, etc. cannot be prevented, but their effects can be reduced. Events like cyclone and floods can now be a forecast and people can be evacuated from vulnerable area. This process of creating awareness about disaster, taking steps to reduce these effects, evaluating the damage caused by the disaster, providing relief, food, and medical aid in affected area involves many people's organization and process. Disaster management is a multidisciplinary task which in the following tasks. First is a preparation. Second is a monitoring, early warning, and meditation. Evacuation, search, and rescue, providing relief in team of medical help, basic needs such as food, clothes, and shelter, recreation and rehabilitation. Disaster management seek risk to reduce risk to damage or loser. It focus on the hazard that causes the disaster and attempts to minimize the adverse impact of the sum of communities. It involves coordination from government, local self-government, police, military, and paramilitary force, NGOs, doctors, scientists, planner, volunteer, and group of the community. Student, let us see next video, disaster and their effects. Let us see.
Disaster types and effects. You might have heard the news of earthquakes, cyclones, terrorist attacks, failure of atomic power plants, etc. These are dangerous events that happen without our knowledge. We call them disasters. United Nations has defined disaster as the sudden event that leads to huge loss of life and property. From this definition, we understand two main characteristics of disasters. The first one is that it is all of sudden event which happens without our knowledge. And the second is it causes huge loss to the life, property as well as to the entire environment. As disasters occurs unpredictably, therefore, it is not possible to take precautions. Note that disasters are different in terms of nature of disaster, period of each disaster, and extent of damage it can cause. Let's try to classify them. One way to classify disaster is natural disasters and man-made disasters. A natural disaster is an adverse event that results from natural processes of the earth. It could be earthquakes, volcanoes, flood, drought, cyclones, etc. Natural disasters can be further categorized into geophysical, biological, meteorological, hydrological, and climatological disasters. On the other hand, there are man-made disasters which happen due to technological growth. For example, industrial accidents, chemical spills, fire, war, crimes, terrorist activities, etc. Man-made disasters can be accidental or intentional. Because of disaster, the life in respective area suffered a lot. Some of the disasters are catastrophic, which takes place all of a sudden and cause great damage, but the recovery takes place in short time. For example, nobody can forget the earthquake of Gujarat and Latur, but now the life in these areas returned to normal. There are other disasters whose impact remains for long duration. Such disasters remain severe or severity increases even after it happens. Other examples include desertification, various problems of crop, global warming, and rising level of oceans, etc. Broadly speaking, disasters affect medical, economic, social, environmental, political, and administration areas of life. Once a life is gone, it is gone. There is no chance of recovery. Others suffer from mental stress, injuries, etc. Mental stress often leads to social health issues. Demand for food, water, and other resources give rise to clashes in the society. The spreading of diseases often create unhealthy environment. Collapsing of bridges, buildings, road transport, railways, etc. cause great economic loss. It causes decrease in productivity and increase in expenditure for recovery. Disasters also lead to pollution of land, air, and water resources, causing various environmental problems. There are problems in functioning of administration because of stress on workers, failure of transport system, and other facilities. The damage to governmental system leads to political problems as well. These are all effects of disaster. I hope you have understood this topic.
Next is the disaster management cycle. In disaster management, disaster prevention, disaster mitigation, and disaster preparedness constitute the pre-disaster planning phase. Pre-disaster planning is a process of preparing in advance to face disaster in future. Let us see the disaster preparedness and involves measure taken to prepare for and reduce effects of disaster. This includes carrying out awareness campaigns, strengthening and the weak structure, preparing plan for households and community levels, etc. For example, if a building catch fire, its resident should know how to escape. For these to occur, they should be trained beforehand. The people living in flood-prone area should be prepared with items such as medicines, food, water, etc. It is the action taken to reduce or avoid disaster and their effects. It should be includes a development policy and planning at regional, national, and international level. It is a continuous process. Next is a mitigation. Mitigation means any measure taken to minimize to impact of disaster before it occur. Mostly it refer to action taken against potential disaster. It is mainly carried out for those disasters which cannot be prevented. Mitigation effects help to people by caring suffer community and reducing load of life and properties. Some mitigation measure can be community level disaster planning, public awareness and information campaigns, preparedness of hospitals, construction of house any away from hazards area, etc. Mitigation effects can be categorized as structural or non-structural. Structural effects includes constructions of river, em- embankments, straightening existing building, etc. Whereas non-structural effects includes area training in disaster management, reducing land use, public education, etc. These measures involve all possible steps to reduce a losses, for example, use of satellite in forecasting flood or cyclones can help in knowing the timing of their landfall. People can be equipment from vulnerable area. In the case of cyclone Fani effects, mitigations effects have helped to bring down to number of deaths. Mitigation lenses the financial impact of disaster on government agents. Next is the disaster response. Disaster response is the way to the community respond to disaster through this is post-disaster process. It reflects the preparedness the, of the community. It include the immediate period after the disaster strikes. It is concerned with providing food and shelter to the disaster victims, responding natural conditions and providing financial supports. Those implementation take to ensure that the needs and prevents of victims are met and suffering is minimized are taken under this stage. The main force in this phase is making people safe till further measure of taken. Next is a rescue. These steps involves measure taken to bring life back to normal in affected area. This involves remediations of basic service and repair of physical, social, and economic damage, cleaning of debris, giving financial assistance to victims, rebuilding roads and bridges, and providing sustainable medical care for displaced human and animal population is included in this stage. Rehabilitation. Through these is the last phase of disaster management. The process of disaster management does not end here. This phase involves efforts to restore normalcy in the long term. This phase may take on many years. Effects these may include providing the housing to the affected, taking important discussions regarding economy, agriculture, etc., which have been affected by disaster. Next is a role of remote, sorry. Next is a role of remote sensing, GIS and GPS in disaster management. Today, information technology is used in this field is increasing of effectiveness and effectiveness in coping with disaster. Map and spatial information are impact components of all information in case of any disaster. Hence, mapping and spatial information acquisition becomes vital for any disaster management. Remote sensing is very effective in mapping disaster prone area, particularly flood affected area. Microwave data can provide information on flood infiltration area. Remote sensing satellites monitor the path of cyclones and it can provide ample time with warning of actualizations of preparedness in advance. The data obtained from meteorological satellites is used for cyclones tracking in intensity of landfalls, directions, and forecasting of extreme water weather events. The data from the Earth observation satellites is used for monitoring disaster events and assessing the damage. The communication satellites help to establish communication in remote and inaccessible area. Navigation satellites are used for preventing location-based services. The GPS, Global Positional System, is also important tools. GIS has emerged as a very important methodologically tools for effective planning, communications, and training in the various stage of the disaster management cycle. It also has vital role to play a determine the extent of hazards and disaster. These techniques are very helpful to make planning and policy very easy for implementations. In pre and post disaster activity management role of GIS, GPS, and remote sensing assume greater impact. Next is the disaster management in India. India's geochemical conditions as well as its high danger of social economic vulnerability make it one of the most disaster prone country in the world. After the tsunami in 2004, approach towards disaster management has tertiary change. Various state government were requested to set up a disaster management office. At the Government of India level, two institutes were set up in New Delhi, the National Institute of Disaster Management (NIDM) and the National Disaster Management Anthology (NAMA). The aims was a migrate the damage potential of natural disaster in future. The Natural Disaster Management Authority has been established at the center and the SDMA at state and disaster authorized at disaster level and gradually being formalized. In addition to these, the national crisis management communities, part of the earlier setup, also function at the center. The nodal ministry are identified for different disaster types of function under the overall guidance of the Ministry of Home Affairs. No, nodal ministry for disaster management. These make the sacred heights interact at different level within the disaster management framework. For disasters such as a drought, the Ministry for Agriculture is the nodal agents. Meteorology force and paramilitary force such as home guard, etc. play an important role. Various agents such as ISRO, NRCS, National Remote Sensing Center, etc. also play an important role in disaster management. Thank you, students.